All right, so thanks so much for the warm words, which I don't really deserve. I'm not going to talk about rap music today. A bit about music, but only in with regards to. Let me just quickly get your videos over here, then I don't feel as alone. I'll talk a little bit about music, but only in regards to how you can access music through the internet. So, as Volker said, this is joint work with Miguel and Martin. It's actually the second paper that we are writing together on this topic, and this one is the newest. So everything that I'm saying is still to take with a grain of salt, and everything is very preliminary. So all your comments and questions will be highly appreciated. So let me start with a little bit of context and background. I guess in this audience, I don't need to motivate such a study by saying that digitization and the internet in specific is, of course, associated with productivity, innovation, employment, economic growth, all the good stuff that we care about. Mostly this good stuff is coming from lower costs on the demand and the supply side. Sort of these are the main channels that very much increasing literature has identified. And of course, it's also important to recognize that nowadays mobile internet consumption has become the preferred mode of internet consumption. So actually yesterday I updated the figures that I had. And I was actually quite surprised to see that like last year, 90% of the world's internet users actually were on mobile devices. The last figure I had in mind was like 50 or 60%. So we're really moving completely mobile, it seems. Now, what's interesting about this is that, of course, access to the internet is key to participate in all the gains that we see from digitization, like economic growth, productivity, innovation, employment, and these kind of things. And then the other stylized fact is, of course, that about 40% of the world population does not have access to the internet. So we are basically excluding almost half of the world population from all these gains that we can enjoy. And sort of this literature on the digital divide has found gender, education, and income as the key determinants. And so if you want to focus on income as one of the determinants of digital divide, then sort of the next question is, can we use price regulation or even government subsidies to help bridge the digital divide and get more people to use the internet? And that's essentially what we're doing in this paper. We're going to ask how price affects mobile internet demand, and with a particular focus on basically three angles. The first is the extensive margin. Sort of, do we get more people to use the internet that didn't use the internet before? That's the bridging the digital divide aspect. But then I'm also going to talk a bit about the intensive margin, which is a different way of saying we care about the price elasticity of those people who are already connected to the internet. And I think that's sounds a bit boring, but actually, if you think about it, we don't often think about prices on the internet because everything is free, conditional on the access price. And now in this paper, we're sort of looking at what happens to internet consumption on the intensive margin once you have variation in the access fee. And then naturally with this, the next question will be, what are the distributional effects based on what are people actually doing when they access the internet? What type of content are they consuming? And that's going to be interesting from several perspectives. First, of course, because of the interplay between network operators and content providers, and that sort of will trigger lots of questions and lots of thought, I guess, especially in this audience, because it connects to lots of policy dimensions, telco policy dimensions such as net neutrality, where we often think hard about how to set right incentives for network operators to keep investing in network infrastructure if most of the gains are actually absorbed by content providers. The other two policy angles that I think are interesting in this aspect are trade and competition policy. Trade in the sense that most of the content and people enjoy are is foreign in a sense, and then if a domestic government sort of provides a subsidy or does a regulation that affects the access price, and people use that in order to consume stuff from abroad, that obviously also has trade policy implications. And then the competition policy aspect here, I guess, is also just grounded in the nature of the markets and the market structure that we observe with content providers, where lots of things are already highly concentrated, and sort of by allowing more people to get access to the internet, are we just helping the big firms to become even bigger? And lastly, I think this is also a question of externalities on the consumer side. If you think about what are people doing on the internet, then you can basically think about two things, although on my slide is only one thing: information consumption versus information provision. So do I just take in what others have put on the internet, or do I actually contribute content that others might find useful? And then if you have more people that can access the internet by bridging the digital divide, you're also contributing to all the good things that are on the internet if people are actually providing valuable content. Now, what's the context in which we are going to study this? So now I'm sort of zooming in from the big picture to the where's actually the empirical context. We're going to exploit exogenous variation in access prices that comes from the roaming regulation that the European Union has been involved in since 2012, where access to the mobile internet while traveling, of course, that's a specific setting, became increasingly cheaper over time. And sort of the latest, sort of biggest installment of roaming regulation, of course, happened in 2017 with what has been coined the Roam Like at Home regulation. But I'll talk more about this. In terms of methods and data, what we're going to do is we have an online experiment where we try to understand how people react to a change in price. On the extensive and on the intensive margin, try to understand what are the content types that they're consuming after a price change. And then we're going to try to reflect that with observational data from the real world and see if the estimates that we get from our online experiment sort of also are comparable to what we observe in the real world. So the key takeaway will be that we think that price regulation, or our data suggests that price regulation can actually bridge the digital divide, but then there are also these intricate welfare effects that are quite interesting to think about. And here's the one slide that sort of summarizes the key results, at least from my perspective. So what we see is that, as a broad summary, access price reduction by a factor of 10 increases the number of internet users by about 50%. And you see that this is sort of broadly true with some variation over different content categories, and we see that in our online experiment and as well as in our observational data. So that's sort of the key takeaway. That's the extensive margin results. But then, as I mentioned, I'm also going to talk a little bit about the intensive margin and a little bit more about the distributional effects. So how does this paper relate to other work on Roam Like at Home, on these roaming regulations? Well, sort of if you think about a price change in a very stylized model, where there's an internet service provider that charges an access fee, and then people can consume stuff on the internet. Then what happens if you lower the price? Then of course there's going to be more consumer surplus. And the focus of our paper is basically this reduction of deadweight loss. This is with the part where people are coming into the market that previously were excluded from the market because of the high price. This entire area, entire shaded area, sort of the overall consumer surplus effects, is the context of another paper that I had the pleasure to work with the same team of co-authors, where we basically focus on trying to estimate the consumer surplus increase after Roam Like at Home, We have individual level consumption data from a mobile network operator in one European country, and this allows us to sort of pin down the consumer surplus estimates. And it's almost 3 euros per user per day, which then, if you aggregate it over all the travel that's going on in the European Union, we come up with some guesstimate of about 2 billion euros worth of consumer surplus. And sort of what we do in this other paper is we focus a lot on exploring heterogeneity by user type, and we show that this varies between different travel types, leisure versus business trips, by usage intensity, by travel intensity, these kind of things. And the consumer surplus estimates that we get in this paper are actually quite similar to what others have found using completely different data. Like these, in this paper, they have aggregate network operator level data, and they basically make the additional step to show that, of course, these consumer surplus gain largely outweighs the network operator losses, which are, of course, quite obvious. If you restrict someone from making a lot of money, then network operators wouldn't like that. And then finally, there's 2 more papers that I want to briefly talk about. This one, they look at pricing and revenues of network operators, and basically show that, at least for Roam Like at Home, there's not much evidence for a waterbed effect, in the sense that once you're forced to reduce the roaming prices, you might have an incentive to increase domestic fees. And that's this kind of waterbed effect happened in earlier regulatory rounds of the EU regulation on roaming, which started in 2012. But with the sort of the biggest chunk, the Roam Like at Home, we basically don't see evidence for that. And then sort of on the what happens to the content that people consume side. This is a very nice paper that looks at Tripadvisor data and basically tries to understand what are people doing with their with the megabytes that they now have sort of at a much lower price, and show that after Roam Like at Home, tourists actually move towards better restaurants, and sort of I guess the title of the paper is The End of Tourist Traps. And so that sort of speaks to this idea that there's also an information provision aspect in the internet access. All right, this just to quickly sort of put our paper into perspective. But again, the focus of this one is really sort of trying to understand the deadweight loss reduction. So I already talked a lot about the roaming regulation. I guess I can be quick on this in this audience, but just to remind you, so in the EU, we had a policy change that basically introduced variation in the key bottleneck to access the mobile internet, which is a price cap on roaming prices, and this is international roaming, right? This is not roaming from one network to another within a country, but this is across borders within the European Union, and that started in 2012, and then we had the biggest drop in 2017. So here the maximum retail prices of 6 euros per megabyte in 2007, which went down to basically no extra charge, can only be the domestic price. And that's basically what we will look at sort of in most of the things that I will talk about. We're going to focus on the 2017 last round of regulation, that's Roam Like at Home, but for some other data sets, we're also going to look back at this longer time frame of 2012. So what does Roam Like at Home really mean? So really quickly, so before June 2017, the retail price cap was basically 5 euro cents plus the domestic price, and then after June 2017, there was a much lower price cap at 0.03 euros. So you can think about this loosely as more than a tenfold decrease in the price. And it gets a bit more intricate because I guess also to protect some of the revenues of the network operators. This was sort of defined as according to the roaming allowance. So let me just quickly go through this, and I guess in this audience everybody knows about the details of Roam Like at Home. So the way you can think about the home data allowance is basically the subscription price is equal to the home allowance times the domestic price per megabyte, and then you can by dividing that you get the home allowance, and then roaming would allow no overcharge, but access to a reduced allowance because of this retail price cap per megabyte. And if the domestic price is greater than the retail price cap, then the user enjoys the full allowance. And if not, then it's not really Roam Like at Home, but sort of you get access to a lower data allowance while being abroad. Just to illustrate this really quickly, what this means in some cases. So let's look at 2 examples. So say there's one data package that's 40 euros for 10 gigabytes. Then in sort of the before Roam Like at Home situation, this would be a home allowance, a roaming allowance of 740 megabytes, and as the price, the home price, which is 0.004 euros per megabyte, is bigger than the price cap, retail price cap. You would get the entire home allowance also as a roaming allowance. So you end up going from less than 1 gigabyte to 10 gigabytes worth of allowance while traveling abroad. And that's different if you're in a different pricing scheme where you pay 20 euros for the 10 megabytes, then you go from 300 megabytes to about 5 gigabytes. So this is just to, I use a lot of words to say this. Actually, if the name says Roam Like at Home, but it depends also a bit on the prices. And it won't matter much for the rest of what I'm going to say, but just for you to keep in mind that, depending on the price level across certain European countries, it really means Roam Like at Home, especially if you are in a higher price regime. But in other countries, actually, you won't, as a consumer, you won't enjoy exactly the same allowance as you have at home. All right. So let me dive into the methods that we're using. So as I mentioned, we're going to use an online experiment, and we're going to look at observational data. So let's start with the online experiment. We basically looked at responses of 2,000 participants that we accessed through an online panel. And these were all Europeans with some variation across different countries. But I guess the biggest number of users were from Germany. We basically do 2 things. So first, we ask them about their home allowance currently. So we ran this in December 2020. And then we present them with 2 scenarios where they sort of envision traveling abroad. First, in a situation, or always in a situation where they don't have access to Wi-Fi or a desktop computer. So they are sort of forced to use their mobile phones in order to access the internet. And in the first scenario, this is going to be like the before Roam Like at Home scenario, where we give them sort of the average roaming allowance that we know from previous studies, and we could also confirm this in a pilot study with this using the same set of participants that we also use for the online experiment. So that's the first setting, only 140 megabytes. And then the second scenario is this after Roam Like at Home, where we actually give them their full home allowance. And then in both settings, we ask them to distribute their data across content providers, and we focus on particular categories of content providers, sort of the most important ones like communication, search, social media, news, music, video, and so on. Right? So this is, of course, as always, the limitation of lab or these types of online experiments is, of course, always that it's a bit artificial, and sort of these are scenarios. We didn't incentivize people, of course. Either way, this is what the questionnaire looked like. So scenario 1, you're traveling abroad for vacation or work. You have a smartphone but no other mobile device. You have access to the internet on your phone, and your data allowance is this and that. And then we asked them to sort of distribute these 140 megabytes across content categories. And this is a screenshot of one particular participant that saw it in this order. So we made sure that it's randomly ordered, and so we don't get any rank effects just because some categories are ranked higher than others. We also gave them some indication of what content means, how you can translate content into megabytes, and made it easy these sliders to also respond to the questions. Scenario 2 is basically the questionnaire looks exactly the same, but here we give them exactly the same allowance as they have in their home country, and here we basically use the value that they provided to us before when we asked them about what is your current home allowance, and then it's the same thing. Just ask them to distribute their usage across these content providers. Okay, so there was also an option that they could leave megabytes unused, and no need to ramp up all the bars. All right, so that's the online experiment. Of course, this is all stated preferences. This is these hypothetical scenarios. This happens during the first wave of the corona pandemic, where hopefully people have not yet forgotten how it feels like to be abroad and using the internet. Maybe these days it would be a bit different, but with all these caveats, this is how we did it. Now, I want to look at some of the results. This is basically what I already showed you in one of the slides before. So we break down the extensive margin by these different consumption categories. Essentially what we're doing is we're running a regression on an indicator variable that tells us whether someone is using the internet that hasn't used the internet before. And then we do this by different categories. So we'll have 1,800 users, of which 42% state to use the mobile internet while traveling before the roam like at home scenario. And then afterwards you get 64%. So it's like on average, it's like 50% more users that are now willing to use the internet at all. And then you see that the effect size ranges across categories, so that the lowest is about 40% for communication, things like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and these kind of things. And the highest is also where you would expect it to be the highest, because it's the most data intensive music and video applications. Okay. Now, what's interesting is once you look at the intensive margin, you get way bigger effect sizes. And here it's like on average, like 11 times more data used. So you essentially go from about 11 megabytes to almost 120 megabytes. And this also varies quite a bit across categories. But sort of the patterns that we also saw for the extensive margin are also not too different when you look at the intensive margin. So things that don't use much data, like communication and search, they're sort of at the lower end, where people increase about 9 times. And then things that you actually use more data, like music and video, you see an increase of about 15 times on the extensive margin. Intensive margin, actually, sorry. So actually, when I say intensive margin, I should say extensive plus intensive, because we're, it's those. So there's also the new users in there. We're basically just looking at how much more. All right. So So key takeaway from this is, they're like 50% increase at the extensive margin, and then way bigger numbers on the intensive margin. Caveat, of course, it's an online experiment, very stylized setting. You just state stuff. It's not incentivized, so you can basically put whatever you want in that questionnaire and so on. We do pay them, of course, to take part, but there's no other incentive to not lie. That's why we thought it would also be useful to look at observational data and basically understand sort of in the real world for different content categories. Also, can we see similar effect sizes? And it turns out the answer is yes, but of course it's nearly impossible to go through all these content categories and understand all the have very good identification strategies for all these content categories. So what we end up focusing on is search. It's news consumption. So I just put two examples here. Big national news outlets versus small local ones. And then social media, we have some data from Twitter. And then with respect to more travel-related stuff, we also have data from Tripadvisor. We actually look at restaurant reviews. So and Volker, you will have to stop me at some point if I take too long. The plan is that for each of these data sets and content provider types, I'll talk a bit about sort of where the data comes from, what our identification strategy is, and then sort of the results are not that important to talk about because it's essentially the same as what we get from the online experiment. So in terms of Google search, we use historical data on search volume. It comes from Google Trends. Google Trends data is great, but it also has some problems. One of the problems is that it's always relative. So you type in a keyword, and then Google would sort of give it relative to the peak in history, and that peak will depend on sort of the timeline that you select, and so it's a bit tricky to compare different keywords to each other. But sort of we looked a bit into the literature and sort of use what people are using in order to deal with that. So that's not the biggest problem. The other problem is that ideally, what we would want to have, of course, is we want to understand sort of are people searching for this while traveling abroad in the EU versus outside of the EU, and while they're using the mobile network. And that's not what we get from Google Trends. We only get keywords, volume of keyword search, relative volume of keyword search per country, and that's it. So we had to be a little bit creative on how can we sort of isolate the causal effect of Rome like at home here. So the idea is that we compare search intensity of travelers in the EU versus outside of the EU, and then we picked travel-related keywords in Italian. Why Italian? Because Italian is spoken by enough travelers for search activity to be visible outside of Italy. So the idea is that when we see someone searching for travel-related keywords in Italian, it must be an Italian that is on holiday. There's all kinds of issues with this assumption, of course, but that was the idea that we had here. And then we get monthly Google Trends data for these keywords in countries within and outside the European Union. And we focus on only Italian because otherwise we would maybe have different seasonal patterns across different countries. So in the end, we end up with 71,000 observations from 19 keywords that are searched in 18 countries between 2004 and 2019. And then the identification or the estimation strategy would be to contrast EU versus non-EU before and after the Rome like at home period. With this, so the idea is really we try to find the Italians as they're traveling abroad and try to understand, do they search more intensely when they're traveling outside of the EU versus inside of the EU before and after Rome like at home, or this roaming regulation happens. And here, what you see is this is these Italian keywords searched in EU countries versus in non-EU countries. And you see when in 2012, the roaming regulation starts to reduce prices. This is where you start to see an increasing trend that is more strongly increasing for these keyword search in European countries than in non-European countries. And this, of course, just the descriptive statistics. Once you run it through a regression model, you can control for a lot more stuff like keyword fixed effects, country fixed effects, month fixed effects, month or year fixed effects, all this kind of stuff. And then you'll end up estimating an increase of 30% since the roaming regulation starting in 2012, and then about 12% after Roam Like at Home. So that's the search results. Now, with respect to social media, we focus on Twitter because, of course, it's more easy to get data from Twitter than from other social media sites. And again, here we have to be a little bit creative on the identification strategy. So again, we need to figure out where is the user located? Is a user traveling? Is a user using the mobile internet? Are they not using Wi-Fi, but are they actually using the mobile network operator infrastructure? And so a few things come to mind that you could do. So you could look at the profiles and see if people sort of specify their home location. The other thing that turns out that not many people are like Volker and actually do that. The other strategy that we did is we looked at geo-localized tweets. Turns out also not so many people do that. So you actually have to allow, you have to have a desktop a desktop computer that has GPS capabilities, and then you have to allow that data to be shared with Twitter in order to get that. And the same for mobile device, but of course, the mobile devices, the GPS is more often built in. But again, you have to allow Twitter to use that information. So essentially, what we end up with is a rather small sample, given the huge size of Twitter, of course, of users where we actually know where they are based, and then understand when they are traveling outside of the European Union versus inside of the European Union, and whether they're using a desktop or a mobile device. And then the identification strategy would be again the same thing, that we are basically contrasting EU travel versus non-EU travel before and after Roam Like at Home. This was a massive data collection amount, and quite frustrating that then in the end you end up with only 13,000 tweets from 900 users. But it's because we have all these restrictions on really figuring out the location, and turns out that people don't share their location very much on Twitter. So a next step might be to try to infer that from what people are talking about on Twitter to understand whether they're traveling. But that's a bit of a problem. So if I just show you some pictures on this, so you can. This is the average number of users per country that we observe. So how many people are using Twitter while Europeans are using Twitter while traveling outside of the European Union? How many Europeans are using Twitter while traveling inside of the European Union? And then this is how many tweets they fire while doing that. And this is the tweets per user. So you can think of this as the extensive margin. This is the intensive. Another way of looking at the extensive margin, and this is kind of like the intensive margin. How much do I tweet? Given that I'm a user of Twitter. And again, here we find about 50% increase for both users and tweets. But interesting, we don't see an increase at the intensive margin tweets per user. Okay, again, this comes with the caveat of a pretty small sample size, and of course we can do more things. So what I'm showing you here is sort of selected on users from one particular country. We have more data that we plan to explore in the next couple of steps, but I'm not sure whether this will get much better because of all the limitations that people actually don't share their location so much on Twitter. Now, let me talk a little bit about news consumption. Here we use data from almost 400 publishers that are active in the German or even German-speaking market. And this data comes from the German Audit Bureau of Circulation. So you can think of this as kind of like an industry association that basically publishes or used to publish back in the old days circulation data, mostly targeted towards advertisers, such that you as a newspaper you could sort of justify your prices. And this sort of has transformed into a very nice database of traffic to news publishers, and news is very broadly defined. So the big tabloid is in there. There's also local news and then specialized stuff like computer magazines and this kind of stuff. The nice feature about this data is that we can actually distinguish between domestic and foreign traffic. So that's because this is all German. It's basically traffic from within Germany and traffic from outside of Germany. And so the identifying idea here is that, since this is all German news and German publishers, German platforms, no non-German would look at this, or most people that access this from outside of Germany would be Germans on vacation. And then the other nice feature about this data is that we can also compare, we also can distinguish between traffic that comes from mobile devices and traffic that comes from desktop devices. So here we're going to compare basically mobile versus desktop, only focusing on the traffic that comes from outside of Germany. That's for the stuff that I'm going to show you real quick in a second. But then, of course, you could also run a triple diff where we also look at from inside versus outside of Germany, mobile versus desktop, before and after Roam Like at Home. Okay. So this is what the raw data looks like. Again, trying to show you extensive and intensive margins. So extensive is the number of unique visitors, so kind of the users, then the total visits, total traffic, and then this is visits by user. And so you see that there's a strong increasing trend, but in a regression model, you can control for all of this stuff, have a different trend for the before period and a different trend for the after period. So that you can actually I think you can, the identifying assumption of a different diff model is not terribly hurt here. And so what you end up seeing is very similar to what I just showed you about the Twitter data. So you get an effect at the extensive margin when it comes to users. You get an effect on the extensive margin when it comes to visitors, but you don't see an effect at the intensive margin when it comes to how many visits per user do you see. Again, the effect size is about 50%. All right. And then the last observational data that I wanna talk about is Tripadvisor. So here we look at restaurant reviews, and then again we had to be creative on the identification strategy. We wanted to again find people who are most likely traveling, Europeans that are most likely traveling, and see them travel to EU destinations and see them travel to non-EU destinations, and then also have some way of measuring whether they're using the mobile internet or whether they're in the hotel room on Wi-Fi with the desktop. And it turns out that Tripadvisor kind of provides the data that we need for that. So here's a vegan burger place in Berlin, where there are 300 reviews. And so I found actually 2 reviews that are written in Portuguese. So this is probably someone, or according to our identification assumption, this is someone who lives in the European Union, but travels inside of the European Union. And then this one user is using the mobile device in order to write this review, and the other one is on desktop. And we do this for all kinds of combinations of destinations and origins and people's travel. So we collect the review data for restaurants in top tourist destinations, sort of the top 500 restaurants in the largest 5 cities and the 20 most visited countries. And of these, the 10 cities are then in the EU. And again, we focused on Portuguese. We want to have these languages that are not shared across different countries in the EU. And so Here we're going to compare reviews from foreigners identified by reviews that are written in Portuguese in EU cities versus non-EU cities, and then the alternative is to compare mobile versus desktop. So here I'm actually going to show you these two estimation strategies: EU versus non-EU, mobile versus desktop only in the EU, before after Roam Like It Home. You might say, well, of course, people outside of Europe speak Portuguese. We also have a way of identifying, or sort of at least convincing ourselves that these people are actually in Portugal, not in Brazil or any of the non-European places where Portuguese is spoken. And we do that based on the location that people provide in their user profiles. The pictures that we get are, again, very similar to the other data sets. Two on the extensive margin users, reviews, and then reviews per user. We get see an effect at the extensive margin. People that used on their mobile phones while traveling in the EU write more reviews after Roam Like It Home, and there are more people that write reviews on their mobile phone while traveling in the EU versus traveling outside of the EU. And this is the comparison, same thing, but comparison between using mobile phone versus desktop computers in order to write the reviews while traveling in the EU. So you get the same kind of graphs. On the extensive margin, you see the effect. On the intensive margin, you don't see much of an effect. This is the same thing in regression form. And again, I just want you to remember that the effect sizes are more or less the same. If you think about confidence intervals, then they are the same, essentially. So we find these 50%. All right. So I'll have 2 more slides, and hopefully I'm doing okay in time. So with all this, I think it's interesting to also sort of take a step back and then think about what does this mean for the content providers, and sort of how does this additional traffic, either on the extensive or on the intensive margin, how does that relate to revenues? And here we can, of course, only do some back of the envelope calculations, some guesstimates. We just as an example for Google search, we know that about 76% of the European population has access to the internet back in the days in 2017. 90% are using Google as the search engine, based on public information from the corporate reports. We can figure out how much money they make per search per user and per day, which is about 4 cents. And then we can from tourism statistics we can figure out how many nights have Europeans spent inside of Europe while traveling. That's these 850 million. And then if we put all this together, we end up with a guesstimate of Google only search gained about 2.5 million from Roam Like It Home. Then you can do similar exercise here. Just didn't put all the details, but essentially the similar exercise. YouTube would be 1 million, Spotify or Facebook would be like 5 million, and so of course these are all it's very guesstimate, and lots of assumptions go into this. But it's just to sort of illustrate what this means. So these numbers are big, but also not huge, I guess. All right, so let me conclude and sort of hopefully trigger some of you to a lively discussion when I tell you what I think the implications of this are. So we do find a substantial increase in demand for the mobile internet, as we see this price drop, which is quite substantial with the roaming regulation. I think there's quite some convincing evidence that this price regulation can actually reduce the digital divide, in the sense that we see more users entering at the extensive margin. For some of the things, we also see the intensive margin much more in the online experiment than in some parts of the observational data. There are some aspects of information consumption, like search and news, and then there's also aspects of information provision, like social media and the Tripadvisor stuff, where people provide restaurant reviews. And we think that this has quite interesting welfare implications. Well, I already mentioned that we, of course, as you would expect, there's an increase in consumer surplus, but also the content platforms gain substantially, maybe even beyond what the revenue implications that are guesstimating before. There's these externalities in the local economy. If people now find the better restaurants, then this also changes things in these kinds of markets. And then, of course, also the network operators suffer. So you get a mixed bag of effects. And I think this has interesting implications for policy. First, we can think about price regulation as sort of being effective in lowering the digital divide, getting more people on the net. But then it also has these trade, competition, and media policy implications, depending on what content they're looking at. And sort of I already talked about what I mean by trade and competition policy aspects in my introduction, and here also added media policy because, of course, it also means that now more people are reading the news, and it has all kinds of interesting implications also from a political economy perspective, but also from a do we want to subsidize the media or not? These kind of questions, and how do we subsidize media and get people more informed? And then probably in this audience, the most interesting question is about the implications for telco policy. What are the long-run incentives for network operators? Sort of these are the only ones that suffer here. Sort of I think this has some interesting maybe lessons for the debate around net neutrality. But I'll stop here and leave the floor to the actual experts on telco policy. Thanks very much for your time.